Okay, so we're here to talk about archaeological evidence of the Israelites in Egypt. Many of you may not know this is a controversial topic, so we're going to start with some of the controversy right off the bat. This is common headlines that you see. Here's the Los Angeles Times doubting the story of the Exodus. The truth is that virtually every modern archaeologist who's investigated the story of the Exodus, with very few exceptions, agrees the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all. And here you can see, other claims about the Exodus, about the Bible. On the right, this is Yev Herzog. He's a prominent archaeologist. He said, "This is what archaeologists have learned from their excavations in the land of Israel. The Israelites were never in Egypt, did not wander in the desert, did not conquer the land in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel." After a century of excavations trying to prove the ancient accounts true, archaeologists say there's no conclusive evidence the Israelites were ever in Egypt, were ever enslaved, ever wandered in the Sinai wilderness for 40 years, or ever conquered the land of Canaan under Joshua's leadership. If you look at Wikipedia, for example, they'll tell you there's a scholarly consensus the Bible is not a true historical record. It's not debated. I personally don't know or have read of a single Egyptian archaeologist alive today that believes the story of the Bible. Not one. There is a consensus. They're as convinced as they are about global warming that the Bible is not true. And I'm not saying global warming is not true or true. I'm just saying there's a consensus. And if you, this is Israel Finkelstein, his famous book, The Bible Unearthed. He said some of the most famous events of the Bible clearly never happened at all. The conclusion that the Exodus did not happen at the time and in the manner described in the Bible seems irrefutable when we examine the evidence. And there was no mass exodus from Egypt. There was no violent conquest of Canaan. Most mainstream scholars do not accept the biblical Exodus account as history. The historical saga contained in the Bible was not a miraculous revelation, but the brilliant product of human imagination. So is the Bible all just imagination and these epic stories that it tells? Well, why do they say this? Why do they say there's no archaeological evidence? This is the traditional biblical timeline. And the reason we call it that is it comes from the Bible itself. So if you look at 1 Kings 6:1 here on the right, for example, you can see that the Bible says it was 480 years from the time of the Exodus till the time of the Temple of Solomon began construction. We have a pretty good idea when the Temple of Solomon was construction began. We have all sorts of ancient sources to kind of verify those dates. So we have an idea within a decade or two of when that happened. And so you can back up from there to the Exodus. And then in Exodus 12:40, it tells us that it was 430 years from the time Israel arrived in Egypt until the Exodus. And then you can back up with the ages of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you can go all the way back to Abraham's birth in 2164. And this is the traditional timeline. And so the archaeologist asks, is there credible evidence that a population of foreigners from Canaan entered Egypt around 1874 BC? Because that would be when the Israelites arrived in Egypt. And the answer is there is not. There's not evidence that you saw a big influx of Canaanites. There's not evidence of the stories of Joseph in the Bible and these things that happened. And so they conclude the Bible's either false or the dates must be figurative, not literal. And as soon as they say they're figurative, it just blows everything up because now you're searching through 1,000 years of Egyptian history trying to find the Israelites in the biblical stories. And you'll have people postulating that it's in the 12th century BC under Ramses the Great, right? That was the movie The Ten Commandments. That's hundreds of years later. That's over here in the 12th century. You'll have people postulating it was much earlier. There's all sorts of guesses because the date that the Bible gives doesn't appear to work for the archaeology. So why is this the traditional biblical timeline? Well, it's because the Bible seems unequivocal. So read here in Exodus 12, it says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it puts a fine point on it saying, and it came to pass at the end of 430 years, even the self same day it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out of the land of Egypt." Couldn't be more specific. That's how long they were in Egypt for. If they were in Egypt for that long, we should be able to find archaeological remnants of them. So these scriptures have cemented an almost universal view among believers and skeptics that the Israelites dwelt in Egypt for 430 years. The chronology these scriptures establish has become the very foundation of the archaeological search for the Israelites. And so I, like all the others, started my search in those same timeframes. And like the scholars, wasn't able to find evidence of the Israelites in Egypt. And I started to question, what if this passage is simply wrong? Is it possible that a simple error, scribal or otherwise, in this passage of the Bible has thrown off much of the archaeological search for the Israelites' arrival and sojourn in Egypt? Is it possible to prove the Bible's true by first showing that one of its passages has an error? Well, what would cause me to think that perhaps this one passage is an error? Well, the first is, if you compare other ancient manuscripts that we have in existence, for example, the Samaritan Pentateuch, it gives a very different version of Exodus 12:40. If you read the Samaritan, it says, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers, which they sojourned in the land of Canaan and the land of Egypt, was 430 years." Well, that dramatically changes the time frame and the timeline and the chronology. Now, for our Harry Potter friends, you'll know the Samaritans are the half-bloods. They're the half-Israelites, half-heathens, and so they were despised by the Jews. Is it possible the Samaritan records are actually better in this case than the mainstream text that we have? Let me show you another ancient text. This is the Alexandrian Septuagint, and it also matches the Samaritan text. Now, this one's important because this is the earliest existing Greek translation of the Old Testament from the original Hebrew, and it dates to the 4th century BC. So it's very, very early. And here's what it says: "And the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, was 430 years." This is Adam Clarke, a famous biblical scholar. He said the Alexandrian copy of the Septuagint has the same reading as the Samaritan. The Samaritan Pentateuch is allowed by many learned men to exhibit the most correct copy of the 5 books of Moses, and the Alexandrian copy of the Septuagint must also be allowed to be one of the most authentic. So is there something to this? Could the dates be wrong, and could that be throwing off a lot of the search for the Bible? Well, what other evidence do we have? And what would the revised chronology look like? So on the top here, you can see the traditional biblical timeline. And you can look at the revised biblical timeline down below if the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint are actually correct. And what you can see is, instead of looking for Joseph of Egypt around 1913 BC, we should actually be looking for him around 1698 BC is when we would look for Joseph. That's 215 years off from where people are looking. If you were trying to find George Washington in our day, you wouldn't find him. And that's largely what's been happening with a lot of the archaeological excavations in searching for evidences of the Bible. So is there any other evidence besides these 2 documents that I've shown? Well, there is other evidence, and it's the Apostle Paul. So in the New Testament, in Galatians 3:17, Paul said, "The agreement God made with Abraham could not be canceled 430 years later when God gave the law to Moses." You see the difference there? Paul says it goes from Abraham, again, when he entered the land of Canaan and made the covenant with God, all the way until the law of Moses, which happened shortly after the Exodus, was the 430-year period. So that's a dramatically different time frame. And I use the New Living Translation because the King James translation is just so difficult for people to follow the wording of the King James. What about others? This is the prominent Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, probably the most famous historian ever. And he had access to Egyptian records and also Egyptian records that are no longer in existence. And he recorded that the Exodus occurred 430 years after Abraham came into Canaan and made his covenant with the Lord, but only 215 years after Jacob, who was later renamed Israel, arrived in Egypt. Does the Bible concur with Josephus's time periods? So if you look here at the top, you can see Abraham's entry into Canaan and the birth of Isaac. There's 25 years between those 2 events, and you can see that's Genesis 12 and Genesis 21. Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born, and Jacob was 130 years old when he arrived in Egypt. The Bible gives us those dates. And so you can see Josephus's assertion that it was 215 years from the time Abraham entered Canaan until the Exodus is matched with other biblical verses. Gives him some credibility that his dates are correct. So let's go back and ask our question again. Is there credible and comparing archaeological evidence that a population of foreigners from Canaan entered Egypt around 1659? In this case, the answer is absolutely yes, there is. And the date corresponds to the beginning of the second intermediate period in Egyptian chronology and the arrival of the Hyksos from Canaan. But those guys can't possibly be the Israelites because the chronology is all wrong, according to the scholars. So let's look at some of the evidence and let's look at the time frames. So this is from the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt, and you can see they date the Hyksos rule to start around 1664 BC and last until roughly 1555 BC. Now, after that, they were conquered, they were driven from the land, some of them were enslaved, but that's the period in which they ruled Egypt. Look how closely those dates correspond to my estimated date for the birth of Joseph at 1668. It's within 4 years, sorry, not the birth of Joseph, from the date Joseph rose to power in the court of Pharaoh. It's within 4 years. Now, my dates can't be perfect because we have partial years and we also don't know the exact date of the start of the Temple of Solomon. We have pretty close estimates. But when you're going back thousands of years, those dates are virtually synonymous for the rise of the Hyksos and the rise of Joseph to power in Egypt. So about 3,600 years ago, the pharaohs briefly lost control of northern Egypt to the Hyksos, or Hyksos is the common pronunciation, rulers who looked and behaved like people from an area stretching from present-day Syria in the north to Israel in the south. Now, Josephus recorded numerous specific details about the Hyksos that have now been validated in the archaeological record. He talked about their chronology, their geographic origin, their occupation, the location of their capital. Most importantly, he asserted that the Hyksos were the Israelites referenced in the Bible. So he formally made that claim. Well, why would he say that? What compelled him to believe that these were the Israelites? Well, first, let's talk a little bit about Egyptian chronology and how the Egyptian dynasties are organized. The first thing is periods of instability in Egypt are known as intermediate periods. So if you take all of Egyptian chronology here on the right, you can see there's 3 intermediate periods. And if you were looking for disruption in Egypt, you'd be looking for an intermediate period because that's when you had different dynasties ruling different parts of the country. A dynasty in the north, for example, like the Hyksos, and a dynasty in the south, originating in Thebes. And so the stability of Egypt was interrupted by these intermediate periods when the central power of the state disintegrated and competing dynasties controlled different areas of the country. The Hyksos formed the 15th dynasty in the beginning of the second intermediate period. Now, these Hyksos, the word Hyksos in Egyptian means rulers of foreign lands. And so these people entered northern Egypt and they took control and began running the country. This is from an article on the bottom here called The Hyksos New Historical and Archaeological Perspectives. And it says, in Egyptian memory, the Hyksos episode clearly stands out as a unique phenomenon previously unparalleled, a time when foreign lords imposed their rule on Egypt. But who were the Hyksos, and why were they in Egypt in sufficient numbers to disrupt the harmony of the Egyptian realm and pose a threat to native Egyptian rule? And what was the nature of their conquest? These intriguing questions, alas, are left unanswered in the Chronicles of Egypt. Now, on the right, I've shown the 30 dynasties of Egypt. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to make a point that all of the kings lists that we have today, where we get the order of the pharaohs, are all incomplete. They're all fragmentary, and they all have disagreements with each other. But one of the best that we use is from an Egyptian priest named Manetho, and he lived in the 3rd century BC. And he wrote a history of Egypt, and Josephus had access to it. So a lot of the Manetho writings we have come from Josephus quoting Manetho. He was a priest of the Temple of Heliopolis, and he had access to many original sources, and it was he who divided the kings into the 30 dynasties that we still use today. That's important because we've concluded, modern archaeology has concluded time and again that Manetho is a reliable and trusted source, so much so that as he divided the dynasties is still what we do in museums around the world today. The information he recorded about the Hyksos is of particular importance in our evaluation of the Bible's historicity. Okay, so if we look at those periods of Egypt and you line it up, you can see that it just so closely matches when Joseph would have rose to power in Egypt. Is it a coincidence that the revised biblical date for the Israelite migration to Egypt corresponds to the Hyksos migration to Egypt, both being at the beginning of the second intermediate period, a time of instability and change in Egypt? Well, let's see. Who were these Hyksos? So these are rulers from foreign lands. They come from Canaan, and they ruled Egypt for about 108 years, at least according to the Turin Kings list. These Canaanite kings later became known as the Hyksos, this word that means rulers of foreign lands, and they were probably few in number compared to the native population of Egypt, but nevertheless, they ruled for around a century. After reviewing Manetho's writings, as well as other ancient records in his possession, Josephus concluded that the Hyksos were the Israelites of the Bible. And so the question for us is, was Josephus correct? Does modern archaeology confirm the claims made by Manetho and Josephus? Well, one of the first things that's claimed is Josephus quotes Manetho in saying that the Hyksos were shepherds. And in fact, he goes on to say that one of his records says they were shepherd kings. And in another ancient source in his possession, he states that the Hyksos were captive shepherds. So what are they? Are they kings or are they captives? Now, Manetho, in another book of his, says that this nation, thus called shepherds, were also called captives in their sacred books. Well, that's an interesting way to describe them, because obviously Pharaoh made Joseph a ruler over the land of Egypt. And it's notable that Joseph and his family were shepherds who were elevated to become rulers. Further, their descendants eventually became captives after there arose up a new king over Egypt that knew not Joseph. So does modern archaeology confirm Josephus's claim that the Hyksos were shepherds? Now remember, shepherds were not common in Egypt. In fact, shepherds are abomination to the Egyptians. They wouldn't even dine with shepherds. And so were these ruling class that came from Canaan shepherds. This is Professor Manfred Bitak, probably one of the most prominent and best archaeologists alive today. He's been digging at the Hyksos capital of Avaris for over 30 years, and he has concluded that Avaris enjoyed a special status like a free zone, and the city was inhabited by shepherds who had huge herds. So again, Avaris is the capital in the northern delta. So the delta is the northern part of Egypt. It's on the eastern side, kind of the entryway to Canaan. And it's one of the most prosperous and fruitful parts of the land because there's areas of large water there where you can grow lots of crops and you can also do lots of shipping. So Professor Bitak explained, we uncovered the remains of a huge town with a population of 25,000 to 30,000 individuals. These people who originated from Canaan, Syria, Palestine. Originally, they may have came here as subjects of the Egyptian crown or with the blessing of the Egyptian crown. Obviously, this town enjoyed something like a special status, like a free zone, something like that. We have some evidence of shepherds. We find again and again in this area pits with goats and sheep. We know shepherds, probably Bedouins with huge herds, roamed around the city. Now, this is important because Professor Bitak is one of the skeptics that does not believe the Hyksos are the Israelites. And he goes to great length. He writes papers about this, talking about how they can't be the Israelites because the chronology is all wrong. And in his view, he asserts that the biblical dates are not figurative, or are not literal, only figurative. Quote, one cannot take at face value the years presented in the early biblical books, unquote. And so even though he's been digging there for 30 years, these aren't the Israelites in his view, even though they're shepherds. The burial of sheep and goats in their tombs provides compelling evidence that Josephus was correct when he claimed the Hyksos were shepherds. Now, this is one of the earliest known uses of the term Hyksos, and it's here on the top right above this man. And you can see there's three Egyptian characters, the character for ruler, the phonetic complement to ruler, and then foreign country. And so the question is it a coincidence that Joseph and his family were shepherds who became rulers in Egypt, and the Egyptian name Hyksos is written with the shepherd's crook that denotes ruler? Is that all a coincidence? Well, let's see what other coincidences we find in the archaeological record. Before I go into too many details, I have to first just start by explaining that in Egypt, particularly ancient Egypt, they defined others as ethnicity by their geographic borders. And so, for example, the Egyptians looked to the northeast, those from the Levant or ancient Canaan, and those were the Levantines. The Libyans were to the west, the Nubians were to the south. Canaan was the name of the large and prosperous ancient country located in the Levant region of present-day Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Israel. It was also known as Phoenicia. People from the northeast of Egypt, including Canaan, were often referred to as Asiatics in the Egyptian texts. So when you hear the Egyptians talking about an Asiatic or we enslaved an Asiatic, they're talking about people from the Levant or people from ancient Canaan. They also say Southwest Asia is a synonym for the same area of the world. So the rise of the Hyksos corresponds to a major migration of foreigners from the Levant, that area anciently known as Canaan. And they came to northern Egypt and they ruled for about 108 years. And if you look at what the construction that they did, it's Canaanite style temples, Palestinian type burials, and Palestinian types of pottery. So once again, Josephus and Manetho are correct when he says these Hyksos immigrated to Egypt and they came from Canaan. Now, modern archaeology has shown that nearly all the Hyksos names were Semitic. So if you look at their names, they're coming from Semitic languages like Hebrew or Arabic or Aramaic. They looked and behaved like people from present day Syria and Israel. And so you have scholars that go and study these names, and they say these are clearly all Semitic names. This one's important because instead of just looking at the types of pottery and the types of construction and the names of the people, we can actually do chemical analysis on skeletons nowadays. And when they look at the chemical analysis of the skeletons, they can confirm that these people immigrated from the Levant. So that gives us very, very strong scientific evidence that they really did come from Canaan. Now, the Hyksos had fair skin and wore sandals and colorful dresses and are bearded in contrast to the clean-shaven Egyptian men. Now, this is a caravan of Canaanites arriving as immigrants to Egypt. This does not date to the time of Joseph. This is earlier. Coincidentally, it happens to date very close to the time that Abraham and his family traveled down into Egypt from Canaan. And yet, in this view, you can also see the word Hyksos is written to describe these people from Canaan coming down to Egypt. Now, the Hyksos immigrants had non-Egyptian weaponry. They had non-Egyptian dress and non-Egyptian names. They're typically portrayed with yellow skin and a hooked nose and long and coiffed hair, a full beard. And their hair, they're often called, they have like a mushroom type hairdo is what that's often referred to. If you look at the clothes that they wear, archaeologists know that the Hyksos were unlike typical Egyptians. Ancient artwork depicts them wearing long, multicolored clothes, unlike Egyptian white attire. But exactly who they were has been unclear. What is the one thing we know about Joseph of Egypt? What is the one thing that we know that Jacob and his family valued? It was a coat of many colors. Israel loved Joseph and he made him a coat of many colors. You know, if you look further into the Israelite story, Tamar, the daughter of King David, had a garment of diverse colors. The Bible records that Sisera, commander in the Canaanite army that took spoils from the Israelites, sees colorful garments as plunder, colorful garments embroidered. The Israelites loved their colored striped clothing. And all through the Bible, you see that time and time again, particular to these people. This is a statue that's been excavated from Avaris, and it depicts a Hyksos ruler. And the point of this is that he holds in his hand a throw stick or a crook. They're unclear what it is because the top is broken off. But they think it might be a throw stick because that was one of the ways that they used to write the word Asiatic in Egyptian. And the important part is if you look at the shoulder, you can still see remnants of the colors that it was originally painted with, striped colors. And here you can see, here's another view, just a little bit larger photo here on the bottom left, so you can see it a little bit better. So modern archaeology has concluded that the Hyksos rulers introduced horses into Egypt. Now, why do I care about that? Well, I care about that because the Bible's first reference to horses comes during Joseph's reign in Egypt, when Joseph acquired horses on behalf of Pharaoh. After the money had failed in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, Joseph gave them bread in exchange for their horses. He bought up all the horses from all the land, including the land of Canaan, and sold bread to people for their horses. The earliest horse skeleton ever found in Egypt belongs to a mare buried in the Hyksos or the Hyksos palace of Avaris. What are the chances the very first horses ever introduced into Egypt come with the Hyksos, and Joseph happens to acquire the horses of the known world for the Egyptians? The Hyksos introduced the composite bow made from a cattle horn and animal sinew. These composite bows were a lot stronger and could shoot a lot farther. And so here you can see the Hyksos. This is an image on the bottom left from one of the tombs, bringing in this composite bow. And all through the biblical narrative, the bow is frequently mentioned. Isaac asked his son Esau to take his bow and hunt for venison. Jacob specifically states that he used his bow in the conflict with the Amorites. King David bade them to teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. They had a particular affinity for the bow, so much that King David wanted everyone in the kingdom to be taught to use it. The Bible just happens to say the Israelites have an affinity for this particular weapon that the Hyksos brought into Egypt. It's not all they brought. They also brought the lyre, which is often mistranslated as harp in the King James Version of the Bible. The ancient Hebrew lyre is the first musical instrument mentioned in the Bible in Genesis 4. It's the star instrument of the Hebrew Bible, being used 42 times in references that span many centuries. Among the Israelites, it was among the most frequently referenced musical instruments, and it's specifically mentioned in connection with the families of Jacob and his uncle Laban. And yet we see the Hyksos brought the lyre into Egypt. Okay, so now the story gets even a little more strange. Josephus, again quoting this Egyptian priest Manetho from the 3rd century BC, records this very strange statement. He said that the Hyksos settled the land without the Egyptians hazarding a battle with them. Now think about this for a second. If you're Egypt, if you're a powerful country, do you give up the very best and most prosperous part of your land to foreigners without even having a battle? Do you just surrender your home and your lands? It doesn't make any sense. And that's why it's a mystery to archaeologists why they would do this. Here's the full quote from Josephus. There was a king of ours, and under him it came to pass, I know not how, that God was averse to us, and there came after a surprising manner men of ignoble birth out of the eastern parts. Remember, that eastern parts is there towards Canaan, and had boldness enough to make an expedition into our country, and with ease subdued it by force, yet without our hazarding a battle with them. They had gotten those that governed us under their power. Manetho tells us that the pharaohs invited the Hyksos to come join them. And they're rather upset by it, that they've influenced the leaders of Egypt. Here on the right, this is from Kim Ryholt. He's a famous archaeologist, University of Copenhagen. He said, in many ways, the Hyksos period is a groundbreaking period in Egyptian history. It's the first time you see a foreign people with foreign habits ruling Egypt. The Hyksos came to represent a trauma for the Egyptians, a trauma so heartfelt that Egyptians were still writing about this in the 3rd century BC. It would be interesting to know why. What was it about the Hyksos that so damaged their view and damaged their society? How is it possible a powerful kingdom like Egypt would let foreign invaders occupy northern Egypt, an area which was particularly fruitful and prosperous, and not even hazard a battle against them? Such an inexplicable event had never before occurred in all of Egyptian recorded history. Is it possible that the Egyptians' unique and unprecedented response to the Hyksos migration could be explained by Joseph's rise to power? So let's look at some of the evidence of Joseph's rise to power and how this immigration into Egypt came about. Well, the first thing is, if you look at Smithsonian Magazine, for example, this quote here in the center, it says, popular lore suggests the Hyksos, a mysterious group of foreign invaders, conquered the Nile Delta around 1638, remained in power until 1530, but written records of their dynasty are scarce, and modern archaeologists have found few material signs of any ancient military campaign. There's other archaeologists, this one quoted from the Science Magazine, that says they believe they traveled to Egypt in peace. And here's Professor Manfred Bitak. He concluded that the Hyksos immigration was done, at least at first, with the cooperation of the pharaohs. The pharaohs invited them in. And surprisingly, there's evidence the Egyptians seem not to have minded the Hyksos at all. And for at least a century, the Egyptians and Hyksos parts of Egypt got along amicably. Egyptologists have found clear indication that the Hyksos kings were rather efficient rulers whose Egyptian subjects seem not to have minded them at all. Furthermore, Upper Egypt, centered on Thebes, Luxor remained under native rule for at least a century. The Egyptians and the Hyksos parts of Egypt got along amicably. The Hyksos occupation of northern Egypt was the first instance of Egyptian subjugation by a people of foreign origin. It resulted in a situation in Egypt, where the land was divided between two territories and cities, Avaris in the north and Thebes in the south. And so you had two different dynasties ruling over Egypt. Now, it's very strange that these two different dynasties would be on good terms with each other. There's evidence found in the tomb of Amenhotep I from the early 18th dynasty and also from the Rhind papyrus that indicates during much of the Hyksos reign, the Hyksos and the Thebans were on good terms with one another, and that the memory of the Asiatic rulers was not as hateful to the Egyptians as the new kingdom, as the early new kingdom, as some of the sources would have us to believe. It was only later, when the Egyptians rewrote their history, that they tried to paint the Hyksos as these foreign invaders that decimated their people. It's abnormal for native Egyptian dynasties to be on good terms with foreign rulers such as the Hyksos. The Bible's account of Joseph's rise to power to become a father of Pharaoh and ruler throughout the land of Egypt offers a possible explanation for this unique and unprecedented situation. Now, it's important to understand that the Egyptians were the masters of propaganda. We think we have lots of propaganda on the news today. We got nothing on the Egyptians. They were far better. If you go travel around Egypt, you can look at temple after temple. You will not see evidence of pharaohs ever being defeated in battle. Very rarely do you see anything that shows they were not masters of the universe. This is from Kara Cooney. She wrote, "The pharaohs ably marketed themselves as nothing less than the saviors of the world, the thoughtful managers of scarce resources, the genius controllers of technologies that built the pyramids and obelisks, the initiated priests who understood the secrets of the universe, the moral dictators. Their propaganda was so clever, so successful that everyone believed them." Well, due to that propaganda, many falsely believed that the Hyksos swept over Egypt like a human tsunami, spreading devastation and death in their wake, before eventually settling down to tyrannize the ruined lands they had conquered. History, as the saying goes, is written by the victors. The Egyptians eventually succeeded in expelling the Hyksos from their lands. Once they had accomplished that, the pharaohs set about writing the history of the Hyksos invasion to maximize their achievement, a version generally accepted by historians until the 21st century. The pharaohs loved to inflate their successes and whitewash their crushing defeats. And after the Hyksos departed Egypt, the Egyptians set about busily purging Egypt of every trace of their former immigrants. So these Hyksos gradually settled northeastern Egypt, and remarkably, they adopted an Egyptian style of government rather than imposing their own. Think for a second how strange that is. If you're a foreigner with foreign religious beliefs that comes from a foreign culture, and you become a ruler in northern Egypt, why would you defer your culture for Egyptian culture and instead support Egyptian culture? The Hyksos adopted the Egyptian style of government rather than imposing their own. And we know that there was no doubt this was a gradual infiltration. This wasn't just done all at once in one effort. For many years, people had been immigrating to Egypt. When Joseph and his family came, they were just one of many settling in an area where others had been settling for a long time. That would be the logical place to invite Canaanites to settle. But allowing a foreign people to gradually settle part of Egypt was a highly unusual event. Egyptian kings were highly protective of their land borders. Allowing a foreign people to settle in a highly prosperous area is not something that would have been tolerated in normal circumstances. Equally unprecedented, it was highly unusual for foreign rulers to simply abandon their own practices and adapt the Egyptian style of government rather than imposing their own. Well, the Bible tells us the exact same thing in the story with the Israelites. So Israel and his family were facing imminent death when they ventured into Egypt. It said, get you down thither and buy for us from thence that we may live and not die. When Israel relocated to Egypt, there was still 5 years of famine left. With the famine continuing, it's clear that additional populations from the land of Canaan and of necessity would have joined Israel and his descendants in Egypt. Here in Genesis 47, we read, "And there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was so very sore, so that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine." That means it wouldn't just be Joseph and his family coming down. It would be everyone in the land of Canaan would come down to Egypt to try to live. Even after the death of Joseph and his brethren and all that generation, the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Remember, when they left Egypt, the Bible tells us there were 600,000 of them. 600,000 of them were men besides children. That couldn't have come from the 70 souls that came out of the loins of Jacob in Exodus 1:5. This is clearly a large population that Jacob and his family are leading and are mixing with. And the Bible records that the famine was over all the face of the earth, and all countries came into Egypt because the famine was so sore in the land. When they departed, it specifically tells us that a mixed multitude went up also with them. We don't see that in the Hollywood accounts as much. We don't see that. We think of the Israelites just being one body of people and one body of people leaving, versus being a mixed multitude of all these people that had immigrated down into Egypt. Well, if you're going to take all these people from Canaan and move them down to the Nile Delta, you can see Avaris there on the map, surely that's going to be disruptive to the populations of Egyptians already living there. How is it possible the Egyptians would tolerate the Hyksos immigration? And why was it done, at least at first, with the cooperation of the pharaohs? Well, the Bible gives a plausible explanation. The Bible tells us the Egyptians willingly sold their land to Joseph. He purchased the land on behalf of Pharaoh and oversaw the relocation of the existing Egyptian populations. Here's what the Bible says in Genesis 47. Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field because the famine prevailed over them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of Egypt even to the other end. He relocated mass numbers of people to make space for people to survive the famine. Joseph is the archetype of Jesus Christ. Joseph saved the world physically, just as Jesus Christ saves us physically through his death and resurrection, and Jesus saves us spiritually. That's what Joseph did for these people. And so clearly he's not going to let people starve. He's going to save the world from famine, as the Bible declares. And the Hyksos rulers did not impose their native religious beliefs on Egypt. Rather, they presented themselves as Egyptian. Now, that's very strange. Surely that's highly unusual. But what do we read about Joseph? Joseph fully assimilated into Egyptian culture. As a father to Pharaoh and ruler throughout the land of Egypt, he presented himself as Egyptian. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, he adopted the Egyptian culture and government rather than imposing his own. He took an Egyptian name. He accepted an Egyptian governmental position comparable to that of the vizier. He became governor over all the land of Egypt. He married the daughter of the priest of Heliopolis. He assimilated so thoroughly into Egyptian culture that when his brethren stood before him, they knew him not. They couldn't recognize him anymore. Joseph dressed as an Egyptian nobleman with fine linen and a signet ring and gold chains about his neck. He spoke the Egyptian language, and he employed an interpreter when conversing with his brethren in their native language. He practiced Egyptian dining customs. He protected the lands of the priests, which was an Egyptian custom. He recognized that every shepherd's an abomination. And most notably, he commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father, the obvious Egyptian practice. And he honored the Egyptian practice of mourning for 40 days. Now, Professor Manfred Bitak notes that Joseph died at the ideal Egyptian age, which was 110 years. That's the ideal lifespan of a man in Egyptian literature. He was so thoroughly Egyptian that he died at the age that Egyptians say you should die as a perfect life. Joseph acted as a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler throughout all the land. The ever-faithful steward, Joseph presented himself as Egyptian and chose to act in Pharaoh's interests and strengthen Egyptian culture and government rather than imposing his own. Why don't we go ahead and take a short intermission so folks can get up and stretch their legs, and then we will come back in about 10 minutes. Okay, so when the Hyksos came to Egypt, they brought with them a patriarchal order where they referred to themselves as the father of the people. In contrast, there's no father-son relationship in Egypt between Pharaoh and its citizens. Now, this is important because all through the Bible, time and time again, we see this father relationship. In fact, if you recall, Joseph himself received the title father of Pharaoh. This patriarchal order of the Israelites is emphasized continually throughout the biblical narrative. Jacob is continually, even redundantly, referred to by the title of father. And the Israelite God is frequently referred to in patriarchal terms as the God of thy father. When they talk about your God, it's always the God of your fathers. That's a patriarchal society all through the Bible. The title father had deep religious significance to the Israelites. It harkened back to the covenant that Abraham made with the Lord when he was promised he would become like God, even a father of many nations. As heir to the covenant, Jacob was continually addressed in the same patriarchal title of father. The title and its symbolic meaning was similarly applied to Joseph. In symbolic contrast, he who was once a slave in the dungeon was elevated to become ruler throughout all the land of Egypt and father to Pharaoh, a Pharaoh that the Egyptians considered to be like unto God. The Hyksos appointed lesser vassal kings that were more like governors. So if you look here on the right, this is from the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt, and what you can see is early 16th dynasty. There's 22 kings over a period of 65 years. Well, that's not a king reigning every 3 years. Those are clearly governors or regional leaders over the people that were employed by the Hyksos. So the Hyksos administration operated more like a tribal chief, how a tribal chieftain would rule over a large extended family. They addressed each other as father, son, and brother. In the Bible, Joseph's brethren are listed at least 60 times in the biblical account. More than just inviting them to live in Egypt, he gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, which likely included land, responsibility, and authority. In other words, he would put them to work in the administration. Manetho asserts that the name of the first king of the Hyksos was Salatis. When scholars study this, they think it's likely that this wasn't actually a name, but rather a title. And you have to remember that the classical writers Manetho and Josephus wrote in Greek. In this language, masculine names often have this is ending that's added on. So, for example, if you're looking at pharaohs or leaders, the Hyksos ruler Apophis, known in the original Egyptian form as a Pep or a Pepi, they would add the is onto it. In the Bible, the reason this matters is in Genesis 42, there's a unique translation. And the translation is Salet. Again, it's lacking the is, which would be the addition for the masculine form in Greek. And it means the governor. You can see I've circled or highlighted in red here at the bottom that this is a unique use of the word governor. Well, the reason that matters was it specifically says that Joseph was the governor over the land. Joseph is yet alive and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. This title explicitly is applied to Joseph. Now, not only that, before the 15th dynasty where the Hyksos emerged as rulers, guess what happened in the 13th and 14th dynasties? Famine plagued the land. What does that sound like? Sometimes the biblical account only gives us a very narrow view of a very specific set of events. But why was the Egyptian pharaoh so keen to believe Joseph when he said a famine was coming? Well, we know that in the 13th and 14th dynasties, Egypt had already been plagued with famines. And in fact, several of the kings had the word nourishment added as part of their royal names, showing that this famine was felt throughout the entire country. How the Hyksos rose to power in Lower Egypt is not entirely clear, but some scholars have suggested that a famine in the Delta region opened the way for the emergence of the Hyksos dynasty. This is Laura Pierce. She says the evidence is transparent regarding the existence of famines during the 13th to 14th dynasties in Egypt. Now, the Egyptian priest Manetho records the famines, and he tells us that this governor, the Salatis, who became king of the Hyksos, he lived at Memphis, and he made both Upper and Lower Egypt pay tribute. He built a city called Avaris, and instead of building it, he rebuilt it, meaning it was already an existing Egyptian city that he expanded upon. And it says he came there in the summertime partly to gather his corn. This is a remarkable parallel to Joseph, right? Joseph gathered corn and he made the Egyptians pay tribute. He gathered corn as the sands of the sea, the Bible tells us. And Joseph made it a law of the land of Egypt until this day that Pharaoh should have a fifth part of the crops grown by the people. The Hyksos distributed grain shipments from the Nile Delta region, that prosperous area where they could grow the most grain, and required the Egyptians to pay tribute for the use of their land. Now, again, why was it their land? Because they had taken possession of it in the Egyptian accounts and the biblical account because the Egyptians had sold that land to Joseph. Joseph bought all the land of Egypt at the request of the Egyptians themselves, who said, "Buy us and our land for bread." Joseph distributed grain throughout Egypt for both food and for seed to sow the land, and he allowed the Egyptians to use the land with the stipulation that they pay tribute equal to a fifth part of the crops that were grown on the land. Again, rather unexpectedly, the Hyksos tribute system seemed to run smoothly. You would not expect that with foreign overlords requiring you to pay tribute. The Bible may shed light on how that was possible. It records that the Egyptians were happily willing to pay tribute to Joseph, for they said, "Thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in thy sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants." And Joseph made the law of the land of Egypt that Pharaoh should have the fifth part. Now, the Hyksos settled northern Egypt. That's also known as Lower Egypt, by the way, because the Nile runs from south to north. And they built this capital called the city of Avaris. Now, that's what Josephus claims, and that's been confirmed in modern archaeology. There is no doubt about that. And even the most ardent critic would not disagree with the assertion that the Hyksos rebuilt the capital of Avaris. The Hyksos did indeed build the capital, and they were a Semitic population, and they had housing styles similar to those of Canaan. We've talked about that a little bit already. When you look at the Avaris capital and you read the excavation reports, you find pottery from Canaan, you find weapons from Canaan, you find jewelry that comes from Canaan, you find jewelry inscribed with poor Egyptian script, meaning the people that were wearing that jewelry couldn't read and write Egyptian very well because they were foreigners and they didn't have a very good command of the language. And perhaps most importantly, archaeologists were surprised to find that when the Hyksos immigrated to Avaris, they allowed the Egyptians previously living there to keep their identity, live in a settlement as a block together, and even provided them with employment in government administration. This was a surprise in the excavation reports. This is man from BTAC here again, and he says, "To our surprise, there's now new evidence that the Egyptians at Avaris were able to some extent keep their identity and also stayed in the oldest parts of the settlement as a block together." Archaeology shows that some Egyptians held high-ranking positions in the Hyksos administration in Avaris, and the newcomers worked hard to immigrate themselves into Egyptian life. In the biblical account, Pharaoh declared unto Joseph, "Thou shalt be over my house, and according to my word shall the people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. I have set thee over all the land of Egypt." As a foreigner, surely Joseph would require assistance from skilled Egyptians who he could employ in government administration. That's exactly what we find in Avaris, even though that's a surprise to the archaeologists. Further, the Hyksos did not leave any inscriptions in their native language, and they did not commission any sculpture or quarrying. That is super unusual. In Egypt, everything is a monument to the greatness of the kings, and everything is propaganda to the people. In not commissioning any original sculpture or quarrying, they remained alien to the Egyptian tradition of kingship. This is one of the reasons why it's said that the Hyksos rule over Egypt stands out as a unique phenomenon previously unparalleled in Egyptian history. It's highly unusual for a ruling class not to leave any inscriptions in their native language. Additionally, if the Hyksos were an invading military force who intended to rule Egypt permanently, surely they would have commissioned sculptures to establish their legitimacy in the minds of the native populations. Lack of sculpture is extremely uncommon in Egyptian context and supports the supposition that the Hyksos were temporary immigrants who had assimilated into Egyptian culture with the intention of eventually returning to their homeland in Canaan. Now, a lot of people say the Hyksos can't possibly be the Israelites. And one of the reasons they cite is because of this Exodus chapter 1, verse 11. It says, "The Israelites built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. Since the Israelites built the city of Ramses, many scholars assume that Ramses II or Ramses the Great was the Pharaoh of the Exodus." This is again from Israel Finkelstein. He says the identification of Ramses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus came as a result of modern scholarly assumptions based on the identification of the place name Pi Ramses with Ramses from the Bible. This is a classic example of how a false premise leads to a false conclusion. After dismissing the Bible's own chronology as merely figurative, and then assuming the biblical account required the 13th century Ramses to be pharaoh of the Exodus, scholars then conclude the biblical account is not historically accurate, as there is simply no evidence at the supposed time of the Exodus in the 13th century BC. If you go to the 13th century, you don't see evidence of an Exodus, therefore the Bible must be false. So they reject the possibility of dating the Exodus to 1444 BC because the Bible indicates the Israelites built the city of Ramses. And the first pharaoh named Ramses came to the throne more than a century after that. And so hence you can see here where I've marked it in blue on the bottom, many claim that if the Exodus occurred at all, it must have been in the 13th century BC. It couldn't have come earlier than that because there was no Ramses before that. And as such, they claim that the biblical timeline is only figurative. Here's man from BTAC again. He asserts that the biblical dates are figurative. According to my opinion, the settlement of the Proto-Israelites in Canaan only happened in the 12th century BC onwards. One cannot take at face value the years presented in the early biblical books. Most of those who accept some historical core for the story of Exodus from Egypt dated to the 13th century at the time of Ramses II, while others dated to the 12th century during the time of Ramses III. So how do you explain this? How do you say the Bible says they built the city of Ramses? Ramses only came later. And so the Hyksos can't possibly be the Israelites. This is a common claim by the critics. Well, my response is you have to remember that the biblical narrative was written centuries after the events happened. So much, much later. And there's established precedent for biblical authors to refer to locations by their contemporary names. Now, when I took my children a few years ago to see the Paris Underground, I didn't tell them I was taking them to ancient Gaul. But that's what it was where we went. We went to ancient Gaul. But instead, I said, I'm taking you to Paris because that's how the contemporary name for that same location. In the Bible, the city of Dan was originally called Leshem, and it was renamed after the tribe of Dan slaughtered its inhabitants and repopulated the area with its own people. This is from Joshua 19. It says, the children of Dan went up to fight against Leshem and took it and possessed it and dwelt therein and called Leshem Dan after the name of Dan their father. So after the children of Israel conquer the city, they name it Dan. Well, here's the problem. Abraham, who is the great-great-great-grandfather of these people, says he pursued a group of people into Dan. Earlier in the Bible, they're referring to the same location by its future name, because that's the name that the locals would know at the time when the Bible was written, when it was codified centuries later. And you can see Israel Finkelstein saying that we know that it was codified in the 7th century BC in Jerusalem. Let me give you another example, the city of Jerusalem itself. We know that anciently it was known as the city of Salem, a Jebusite city until it was captured by David. After it was captured by David, it was renamed Jerusalem. And yet in the Old Testament, authors consistently referred to Jerusalem well before the chronology of when it was renamed Jerusalem. They're naming the city by the contemporary name, not by the ancient name in the biblical manuscript. Well, why does this matter? Because guess where Pi Ramses is? It's right on top of the city of Avaris, the city of Avaris that came centuries before the city of Ramses. And so the Israelites settled in the land of Ramses and built the city of Ramses. That's what the Bible tells us. The Hyksos capital was from 1664 to 1555. And here on Google Maps, you can see here's the Avaris Hyksos capital on the bottom of the map. And there you can see the city of Pi Ramses that's 1 mile distant from it. And geographically, the ancient Avaris capital encompassed about 2.5 square miles. So by definition, the city of Ramses is literally on top of the ancient city of Avaris. And so when the Bible says they built the city of Ramses, it doesn't necessarily mean it had to be the more modern, later city of Ramses. The city of Avaris, built by the Hyksos, is on the exact same piece of land in Egypt. And not only that, these two cities were so intertwined that the inhabitants of Ramses were conscious of the site's Hyksos past and continued to use the term harbor of Avaris as a toponym for that region of the town. They continued to refer to the city of Ramses as Avaris even centuries later. I wanted to zoom out so you could just see really what we're talking about. We're talking about a biblical claim that the Israelites built a city named Ramses, and we're talking about the Hyksos capital of Avaris that is underneath that city and predates the city of Ramses. They are literally at the same geographic location in Israel. What are the chances that's a coincidence? Not only that, the city of Avaris is built in the best of the land. It's one of the most fruitful and prosperous areas. Uh, Results from the geological and geophysical survey point to its position near the eastern outlet branch of the Nile in the presence of three possible harbors. Such strategic positioning would have given the site's inhabitants access to land-based, river-based, and sea-based trading routes. It was an extremely prosperous area of the land. And what do we read in the Bible? That Joseph gave his father and his brethren some of the best of the land of Egypt to dwell upon. Avaris experienced a population explosion at the beginning of the Hyksos dynasty. The famine and plague had ended, and the population rebounded. Avaris was now the new power center. People poured into the city from around Egypt and the Levant. It's exactly the same thing that the Bible tells us. As a particularly prosperous region that was also near the Levant, Canaanite and other peoples had been immigrating to the Nile Delta for many years before Jacob's arrival. This would explain why Jacob and his family could grow so quickly and could become so populous in a short period of time. The existence of other Asiatic populations already living in the Nile Delta may explain how Jacob's family of 70 souls could multiply so quickly that the Egyptians would declare, "The people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we." Clearly, Jacob's family joined with other local groups, for they multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Furthermore, when they eventually departed Egypt, they were a mixed multitude. So not only did you have foreigners immigrate to Egypt and settle on the same piece of land, when they departed Egypt, both groups, the Hyksos and the Israelites, specifically departed from the same piece of land. The Bible tells us the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth in the Exodus. They left the city of Avaris. And if you look at the chronology of Avaris in the 18th dynasty, which would have corresponded to the revised biblical date of the Exodus, we see that Avaris was partly abandoned. What are the coincidences? What are the chances that both the Hyksos and the Israelites rose to power in Egypt at the same time, built their most prominent city in the same geographic location, and departed from that city when leaving Egypt? Just that alone should cause scholars to stop and pay more attention to the Hyksos instead of dismissing them outright because the chronology doesn't match what they expect. Now, I need to tell you quickly about signet rings. So these are examples of signet rings. You'll see these in Egyptian museums. And pharaohs would wear these, and they would basically stamp or seal their important papers. It was a symbol of power and their authority. And the reason this matters is Joseph specifically received one of these when he was given authority. The Bible tells us Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. So we know Joseph was in the position of using signet rings. Well, guess what happens when we go excavate at Avaris, the Hyksos capital? This is Manfred Bitak again, most famous archaeologist alive today, an archaeologist who does not believe the Hyksos are the Israelites. And he says, it's very strange that we found 9 seals with the name Jacob Har. It's a biblical name, by the way. The original was probably mounted on a ring worn on the finger, and this gives us a new puzzle. You see, Jacob is the transliteration of the name Jacob or Israel. This is super important. It's unprecedented to find a Hebrew name on an Egyptian signet ring. This is the only time that a Hebrew name appears on an Egyptian royal seal. It directly connects Avaris with the Bible. And remember, Joseph comes from a patriarchal society. You always defer to the fathers, the God of your fathers. And so as Israel arrives in Egypt, everything Joseph would do would be under his father's name in a patriarchal society because he was still patriarch of the family. And so at Avaris, we specifically find these signet rings that have the name Jacob inscribed on them. And Professor Bitak acknowledges it's a biblical ring. He acknowledges he can't explain it, and he says it's just a new piece of the puzzle. Jacob is the exact transliteration of the name Jacob, and the Har actually refers to a hill, a mount, or a mountain. Now, that may be important to us because as Christians, we understand that Jacob made his covenants with God on the Temple Mount or the hill. And so this may have been a reference to him having been endowed or received the covenant that his father Abraham had received from God. No less than 27 of these Hyksos scarab seals bearing the name Jacob have been found. And importantly, 3, more than any other location, came from Canaan, meaning Jacob was known in Canaan and he was using these seals to administer trade and other government administration with the land of Canaan. The discovery of the Hyksos scarab seals bearing the exact transliteration of the Semitic name Jacob provides a compelling and powerful connection linking the Hyksos to Jacob and his Israelite family. Now, we know that the Hyksos were in a position of power for 108 years, is what the manuscripts tell us, and we know the Israelites were in a position of power for them to increase abundantly. How many years does it take for you to become a large and powerful population? In the biblical account, what happens is that there arises a new Pharaoh that doesn't know who Joseph is. Now, remember, after Israel arrived in Egypt, Joseph reigned for another 71 years before he died. And it was only after Joseph died that things got bad between his people and the native Egyptians, and eventually they were conquered by the Egyptians. Over the course of many years, the Israelites had become numerous and powerful, even exceedingly mighty, to the point the Egyptians worried because they had become more numerous and mightier than we. Even though the Bible does not provide specific details, surely the powerful Israelites had to be subdued in battle before they could be placed in bondage and forced to serve with rigor. As in most large military campaigns, surely there were many outcomes. Many Israelites died, others fled from Egypt, and those who remained were placed in bondage. The Bible records that not all the Israelites were enslaved. We often think about just the period of slavery, and the Hollywood shows you that they're all slaves. Rather, the Bible tells us some were expelled from the land. It says, there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph, and he said unto the people, come on, let us deal wisely with them, and so get them up out of the land. His first intent was to drive them out. Only secondary was his intent to make them slaves. And that's exactly what we see happen to the Hyksos. Now, this is almost the first. It was under his reign that the Egyptians at Thebes rose up against the Hyksos, defeated them in battle, and expelled many of them from the land. He then further chased them all the way back to where? Canaan. And he made battle against them in Canaan. The Hyksos made their last stand at Avaris and were defeated. Some of the survivors fled to southern Canaan, but there's also evidence that many were captured and distributed all over the country as slaves and soldiers. Here at the bottom, this is Andrew Curry. He says Avaris was conquered and partly abandoned in the 18th dynasty. Around 1550, Betac says its people were not expelled, but distributed all over the country as slaves and soldiers. So here again, modern archaeology has vindicated Josephus. His assertion that the Hyksos shepherds made their last stand against the Egyptians at Avaris has been confirmed in the archaeological record. Now we don't have a lot of accounts of the defeat of the Hyksos, but one that's really important is from this guy named Amos. He's the son of Ibana, and he's an Egyptian soldier, and he participated firsthand in the siege of Avaris. Inscriptions in his tomb at El Kab record that some of the Hyksos fled to Canaan, and the others were captured and became slaves. Some of the conquered Hyksos were taken as slaves, and others fled to the city here that you can see on the map, Sharuhen. Perhaps not coincidentally, the Bible references Sharuhen as one of the cities that was later allocated to the tribe of Simeon as an inheritance after the Israelites later entered Canaan. In his autobiography, Amos writes about the Hyksos expulsion. And this is particularly important because it's our only contemporary source, the only one that was an eyewitness that was actually there. And he confirms that many of the Hyksos were driven out of the country, and many others were taken as slaves. In fact, he himself writes about receiving slaves. He said, Avaris was spoiled, and I brought spoil from there, 1 man, 3 women, total 4 persons. His Majesty gave them to me as slaves. Later, he participated in the siege of Sharuhen in Canaan, and he was also awarded slaves. And then later, after they had conquered the Hyksos and the southern Canaan, What it says is Pharaoh went south to the Nubians, and His Majesty had slayed the nomads of Asia. He sailed south to destroy the Nubian bowmen. His Majesty made a great slaughter among them. Then I was rewarded with gold once again, and 2 female slaves were given to me. His Majesty journeyed north, his heart rejoicing in valor and victory. He had conquered southerners and northerners. Now, this is important. This idea that the Hyksos are somehow in cahoots or related to the Nubians in the south, there's a biblical reference to that I'm going to share with you here in a minute. But it matters that the Pharaoh in Thebes rose up, expelled the Hyksos, and also conquered the Nubians to the south. Now, the biblical timeline indicates there's a 110-year gap between the Hyksos downfall and the Exodus. What that means is, when we think of the Exodus where Moses parts the Red Sea, is clearly not the destruction and capturing of the Hyksos, because it's 110 years too early. Ironically, scholars who reject the biblical account speculate that the defeat of the Hyksos may have inspired the Exodus. This is from Science Magazine. It says, the Hyksos ruled for 100 years, and then the pharaohs recaptured their territory. Researchers have speculated that the pharaoh forces banished the Hyksos rulers to Southwest Asia, and the punishment may have helped inspire Exodus, the biblical story in which the Israelites left Egypt and eventually reached the Promised Land in Southwest Asia. That's pretty ironic to hear them talk about the Hyksos inspiring the myth. So many interpret Genesis 15 and Acts 7 to indicate that the Israelites were in bondage for 400 of the 430 years in Egypt. Now, that's not my interpretation of those scriptures, but that's a very common interpretation that people have. Well, the reason we know that can't be the right interpretation is because we know Joseph reigned for 71 years after Israel arrived in Egypt. And it's only after Joseph died that the Israelites fell into bondage. And so if he reigned for 71 years, and the entire period from when Israel was there to the Exodus was only 430, it can't possibly be that they were slaves for 400 years, because Joseph would have still been reigning as part of his 71-year reign in that 30-year period. So those dates can't possibly be correct. And what this means is the period of Israelite slavery must have been much shorter than people think. If you ask the common Christian in any Christian church today, how long were the Israelites slave in Egypt? They will tell you 400 years because of the interpretation of those scriptures. It's very likely that their period of slavery was far, far shorter. And this is one of the reasons why it's been so difficult to find evidence of Israelite slavery in Egypt. Now, we have other evidence that people ignore, that the period of Israelite slavery was far less than the 400 years that's commonly believed. For example, people narrow in on the scripture we talked about again from Exodus that says they would be 430 years from the time Israel got there until the time of the Exodus. But they skip over Genesis 15, where the Lord tells them that the fourth generation shall come out from Egypt again. Well, why does that matter? Here on the right, you can see the 4 generations. And do you realize that Moses is the grandson of Kohath? Kohath immigrated to Egypt. He was an immigrant that immigrated to Egypt in peace. He came with his father. Joseph was still reigning for 71 years at least after Kohath already got there. And here's Moses, his grandson, who's now freeing the Israelites. The period of Israelite slavery was likely far less than commonly believed. And in fact, I believe it was somewhere in this 110-year period. So you can see here's Jacob when he enters Egypt. You see the period of Joseph ruling with his family until Joseph dies. You see the Hyksos then eventually lose power several years after Joseph's death. And so the maximum period of slavery would have been from Joseph's death to the Exodus, but it's far more likely that it's this shorter period, this 110 years. And look, compared to when Moses was born, this 110 years, would have only been less than 40 years before Moses is born that they were in slavery. If you step back and think about it, is God going to hear the cries of his people for 400 years before he does something? Is that the God that's merciful and just and that hears your prayers? 400 years is a very long time. I think it's far more likely that this chronology is correct and that it was a far shorter period of Israelite slavery. Now, contrary to the claims of the archaeologists who assert there is no evidence whatsoever the Jews were ever enslaved in Egypt, there is in fact compelling evidence of Israelite slavery when one looks in the right time frame. the narrow window between the Hyksos downfall and the Exodus. So if you look between 1555 BC and 1444 BC, there's ample evidence of Israelite slavery in that very narrow window. And I'm going to share some of it with you. I'm going to show you the tomb of Rekhmire. And I've actually taken Hiram and Kay, my two oldest children, to see this tomb firsthand. So who was Rekhmire? Well, Rekhmire is the guy that would know about Egyptian slavery if there was slavery. Why? Because he was the vizier of Egypt. He was literally in charge of administering the government under both Amenhotep II and Thutmose III. Those would have been the pharaohs that would have been operating directly before or during the Exodus. And so this is the administrator of the government of Egypt. If anyone would know about slavery, it would be him. And so this is his tomb. It's in the Valley of the Nobles, just across from Luxor. And this is our good friend Hassan. He's our local Egyptian guide to get us through all the checkpoints. Rekhmire is the vizier of Egypt. Therefore, he's in charge of all the civil administration of Egypt. And this is his funerary chapel. And there's a long corridor. And you can see I've highlighted here in yellow a scene on the side. So here's a blown up version so you can see the full side of that corridor. And what you can see is there's Asiatic slaves and Nubian slaves that are drawing water, mixing it with mud and straw, and making bricks for Pharaoh. Now, for those that know the biblical story well, this is exactly what the Bible says. These are captives, and they're clearly light-skinned and dark-skinned for the light-skinned Easterners and the dark-skinned Nubians from the south. And they're making bricks for the workshops of Amun in Karnak. Here's other scenes where you can see them loading up the mud and after they mix it with the straw. And then here's Egyptian taskmasters. So I've pointed to two of them here. You can also see them here. Do you see how they're dressed differently than the slaves, which just have a loincloth around them? And they also hold a whip to whip the slaves. Now, what does the Bible tell us? The Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor and made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people, saying, "Ye shall no more give the people straw to make bricks, and heretofore let them go and gather straw for themselves, and the tale of bricks shall not diminish." Rekhmire's funerary chapel clearly shows both fair-skinned Asiatic and dark-skinned Nubians as Egyptian slaves. Recall that Amos, the son of Ibana, the Egyptian soldier who participated in the siege of Avaris, recorded that after King Amos's defeated the Hyksos, he sailed south to destroy the Nubian bowmen. His Majesty made a great slaughter among them, and then he was rewarded with slaves. He had conquered both Southerners and Northerners. What are the coincidences? You just have the two defeated peoples working together as slaves in ancient Egypt in the tomb of the vizier who would have been there when the Egyptian slavery was happening. And we have evidence that the Hyksos, when they were in battle with the Egyptians, tried to form an alliance with the Nubians. In fact, they tried to send a letter to the Prince of Kush so he could come to their assistance, but the messenger was intercepted by the Egyptians, so it didn't get there in time. And ultimately, the Theban pharaohs defeated the Hyksos in the north and then went south to the Nubians. Now, why does this matter? And why would seeing Asiatics and Nubians together as slaves under Egyptian taskmasters matter? Well, because Moses married one of those women from Cush. So remember, the Hyksos attempted to forge this alliance with the Nubians in the south. They sought assistance from the Prince of Cush. Later, Moses would marry the Cushite woman who was likely the Cushite princess. We have some ancient records that indicate it was likely the princess that he married. Most biblical translations refer to Moses' wife as Cushite. Cush is the dark-skinned race of Eastern Africa, south of Egypt, and the name of the country, Ethiopia. Interestingly, in the Bible, Miriam complains that Moses married a dark-skinned Cushite woman. She was a little bit of a racist, and she said, "You can't marry a black-skinned woman." And so in response, the Lord cursed Miriam to become white as snow. "You don't think she's white enough for you? Then I'll make you even whiter." And he gave her leprosy, and she became white as snow for complaining that Moses had married a black woman. Is it coincidence that the Hyksos sought to forge alliances with the Nubians from Cush, and later Moses would marry a Cushite woman? Recall that the Hyksos are known to have had fair skin. Is it really just coincidence that Reckmeyer's funerary chapel depicts both fair-skinned foreigners and dark-skinned Nubian as slaves making mud bricks for their Egyptian taskmasters? Not only that, is it coincidence that Reckmeyer's tomb would be obliterated and erased? Even though he came from a prominent family and he was one of the most powerful people in Egypt, if not the second most powerful person in Egypt, his tomb was later defaced. As vizier, Rekhmer was the chief administrator of public works and was responsible for overseeing Egyptian slaves. Is it possible the departure of Egypt's slaves during the Exodus caused Rekhmer to be deposed? The cause of his political and personal downfall remains unclear. It is suspected he fell into disgrace. Another part of the mystery here of what may have happened. So Josephus tells us an agreement was reached with the Egyptians that the Hyksos would leave Egypt without any harm to be done to them, and they went away with their whole families and effects. Now, what does that sound like? In the Bible, we read something very similar about the Israelites. And Josephus tells us the Hyksos left Egypt. They traveled through the wilderness and built the city of Jerusalem. He wrote, the Hyksos took their journey from Egypt through the wilderness for Syria, but that as they were in fear of the Assyrians who had dominion over Asia, they built a city in a country which is now called Judea, and that large enough to contain a great number of men, and called it Jerusalem. After the Hyksos' departure from Egypt, the Egyptians attempted to purge Egypt of every trace of the Hyksos and attempted to rewrite history. Just as the origins of the Hyksos are uncertain, likewise, nobody knows where they went after they had been driven out. Certainly, there was no point asking the Egyptians. They set about busily purging Egypt of every trace of the former immigrants and set about rewriting the history of the conquest to make their triumph look greater. Remember, the pharaohs love to inflate their successes and whitewash their crushing defeats. So let's circle back where we started as we finish up this presentation. The scholarly consensus is the Bible is not a true historical record. There's no evidence of Israelites in Egypt. There is no evidence that confirms the Bible is true. In fact, just the opposite. Everything they find proves the Bible is false. Some of the most famous events in the Bible clearly never happened at all. The conclusion that the Exodus did not happen at the time in the manner described in the Bible seems irrefutable. Most mainstream scholars do not accept the biblical Exodus account as history, and the historical saga contained in the Bible was not a miraculous revelation, but a brilliant product of human imagination. They just imagined it all up. And remember, the reason for this is largely because the chronology is all wrong. When you look at the chronology, they don't find evidence of the Israelites, and so they say there can be no real connection there. All in all, the chronology makes the archaeologists look in the wrong time periods. So I'm just going to briefly summarize what we've talked about. We've talked about the consensus of the Bible being false. We talked about the widespread belief that Israel and his descendants were in Egypt for 430 years. We showed the Samaritan Pentateuch, which translates that verse differently to say they were in Canaan and Egypt for 430 years. We showed the Greek Septuagint showing the same 430-year period started when Abraham entered Canaan, not when Israel entered Egypt. We quoted Paul, who said the agreement God made with Abraham could not be canceled 430 years later when God gave the law to Moses. And we quoted the historian Josephus, who also said it was 430 years from Abraham to the Exodus. We talked about periods of political strife known as intermediate periods, and how if you're looking for Joseph and his family, you would tend to look towards a period of disruption in Egypt. The Hyksos began the second intermediate period. We talked about how they became the 15th dynasty. They came from Canaan, and they were known as rulers of foreign lands. We've talked about how their rule over Egypt was a unique phenomenon previously unparalleled in all of Egyptian history. The nature of their conquest has left Egyptologists questioning where they came from and where they went. Josephus believed the Hyksos were the Israelites of the Bible. He recorded numerous details that have now been validated in the archaeological record. He stated they were shepherd kings, for example. In another record, he stated they were captive shepherds. Archaeology has shown that the Hyksos were indeed shepherds, just as the Israelites were. We found that the Hyksos names were Semitic. They looked and behaved from people from present-day Syria and Israel. We've talked about chemical analysis of the skeletons there, showing that they can be traced, their immigration can be traced to the Levant. We've talked about how they have fair skin, They wore sandals and colorful dresses and were bearded in contrast to the clean-shaven Egyptian men. They had long, multicolored robes and clothing, the thing that the Israelites were passionate for. We talked about how that modern archaeology has confirmed that the Hyksos introduced horses into Egypt, and the Bible's first references to horses came from Joseph Egypt as he gathered them up, giving people bread for their horses. They introduced the composite bow and the lyre into Egypt. The Israelite affinity for the bow and the lyre is frequently mentioned in the biblical narrative. They traveled to northern Egypt and settled the land without a military campaign, which is surprising and unprecedented. There's clear evidence the Egyptians seem not to have minded the Hyksos at all. Further, Upper Egypt, centered at Thebes, remained under native rule, and for at least a century, the Egyptians and the Hyksos parts of Egypt got along amicably. As masters of propaganda, the Egyptians attempted to rewrite the history of their relations with the Hyksos to paint them as tyrannical rulers that swept over Egypt like a human tsunami. We've talked about how they had a gradual immigration from Canaan and it was disruptive to existing populations, and how the land became filled with them. They adopted the Egyptian style of government rather than imposing their own, just as Joseph did. They brought a patriarchal order to Egypt, just as Joseph and his family operated under. They appointed lesser vassal kings and addressed each other as father, son, and brother, just as they did in the Bible. The Egyptian priest Manetho recorded their first ruler had the title of Salatis, which means governor, and Joseph was specifically given the name governor in the Bible. Famine preceded their appearance in the 15th dynasty and opened the way for them to take power. That they distributed grain shipments from the Nile Delta region and required Egyptians to pay tribute, just as Joseph did. We talked about the scarabs that were found at their capital, inscribed with the name Jacob. And we've talked about how Manetho claimed the Hyksos built the city of Avaris. That's been confirmed by the archaeologists. And at Avaris, you see things like Canaanite pottery, weapons, and jewelry. They were surprised that when they took over Avaris, they let the Egyptians previously living there keep their identity and even gave them employment, government administration. They didn't leave any inscriptions or texts in their native language. They didn't do any original sculpture or quarrying, something that would be alien to Egyptian tradition of kingship. They built the city of, the Bible records the city of Ramses was built by the Israelites. Not only did the Hyksos settle on the land of Ramses, but their capital city of Avaris overlapped with the city of Ramses to a large extent. And the biblical account was written centuries later, where it was established precedent for biblical authors to refer to locations by their contemporary names versus their ancient names. How the city of Avaris, the harbor of Avaris, was still a known toponym for part of Pi Ramses, even in the later dynasties. How Joseph gave his family a possession in the best of the land, and Avaris was located in the best, most prosperous region of the land. How they both departed, both the Israelites and the Hyksos departed from Egypt, from Avaris when they left Egypt. How Joseph wore a signet ring as a symbol of authority, and how Professor Manfred Bitak acknowledges it's very strange that his team found 9 royal seals at Avaris inscribed with the biblical name Jacob, which is the exact transliteration of the name Jacob. How 27 of these seals have been found, 3 of them from Canaan, more than any other location. And how the Israelites remained in power for a period of time to become numerous and prosperous, just as the Hyksos did. How a pharaoh rose that drove them out of Egypt and enslaved others. Those that weren't driven out were captured and distributed as slaves and soldiers. And how, if you look at the vizier of Egypt during the biblical date of the Exodus, his funerary chapel shows Nubian and Asiatic slaves making mud bricks from straw under the supervision of Egyptian taskmasters. The Hyksos attempted to form an alliance with the Nubians, and Moses would later marry the Nubian princess, and how they left Egypt without any harm being done to them and went away with their whole families and effects, and how the Egyptians tried to erase their entire history. So we've been through a lot tonight. Joseph made numerous specific claims about the Hyksos that have now been validated in the archaeological record. Most importantly, he claimed the Hyksos were the Israelites referenced in the Bible. Was Josephus correct? Are the Hyksos the Israelites of the Bible? Are scholars correct when they insert that the chronology is all wrong and there can be no connection between the Hyksos and the Israelites of the Exodus story? When I think about this at times, I get these little bubbles that pop up in my head when I'm meditating on the Bible. And I wrote down some of these bubbles. And as I step back and I think, what is the probability that all of these Hyksos Israelite parallels are simply coincidences? What are the possibility that a people arose at the same time, took over the same part of northern Egypt, built their capital city in the same exact area of land within a mile of the later city of Pi-Ramses, introduced horses into Egypt, wore long multicolored clothes, happened to have the name Jacob, happened to get along amicably with those they had conquered, supposedly? Clearly, there's a lot of evidence that has been overlooked for the biblical narrative. Uh, More important than the archaeological evidence, each of us can come to know the Bible is true by reading it and having the Spirit of God impress the truthfulness of it onto our hearts. And that's open to all of God's children to know for themselves that the Bible is true. And I witness to you that it is true. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.